Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's guest is a businessman and playwright who has interests in ancient archaeology, UFOs, and has had fascinating experiences whilst working on engineering projects in Turkey. Here to talk about his life and experiences, I'd like to welcome on board the starship Bari Chohan.
I'm glad to be here, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Okay, and you've brought in a few things for me to look over which kind of document some of your life, and because your family originate from India.
That's correct.
A
yes.
Muslim family.
Yeah.
And they were ophthalmic.
Homeopathic ophthalmic physicians.
Okay.
And they've been in the UK since late Victorian period, 1880s.
So you were born here, weren't you? You were born in Nottingham.
Yes.
But you've lived in Middlesbrough all your life.
All my life, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's, most sort of British Muslims, their families came here kind of in the 70s and 80s, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, so your family goes back in Britain to...
Over 100 years.
Over 100 years.
Yeah.
And you've given me a picture of your mother here. Put that on the screen. And sadly, she's died very recently.
Yeah. She passed away last June, and 77 years old. And she came to England in 48. Right. And in those days, one travelled from India by ship. And straight after partition, she was married and came here. My father had been in Britain since the mid-30s.
Yeah. And you did a degree in politics and history, is that right?
My first degree was in politics and history at Bradford University.
All right.
And then I was in the politics department at Durham University, where I was doing an MA by thesis on the political growth of Middlesbrough, 1850 to 53. Okay,
and throughout the years you've had, a wide variety of business interests in property, and you were on the board for One North East, which is the North East funding agency. There's a picture of you there. Yeah. So you've also had, you've worked on, or you've had a screenplay produced on BBC dramas that you've written.
I was very proud of that. It's a little autobiographical,
right.
And it was set in Middlesbrough.
What was that called?
It was called Bottles, and we were very fortunate that at that time the BBC actually had two plays based in Middlesbrough a few weeks apart. One was the wonderful Alan Bleasdale's Boys from the Black Stuff, and mine was on a few weeks later. But I was very fortunate that mine was on after the most popular programme at the time on TV,
right.
Starsky and
Hutch,
the cops show from America. And we were on straight after, so we had a fantastic viewing.
All right.
But it was all set in Middlesbrough. It was quite interesting.
And your brother has researched photography of Middlesbrough and published this book. RAF Chohan is your brother.
Yeah,
and this
I contributed. I contributed to it.
Lots of historic pictures of Middlesbrough.
And the actual anecdotes, the written part. In fact, most pictorial history books rarely sell more than a few hundred copies per annum, doesn't matter where they are. That's now in the 7th edition, and I think for a town the size of Middlesbrough, it's quite remarkable. There's about 15,000 copies so far been sold. And we still get calls in the middle of the night from Australia and Canada. It's amazing the book has travelled all over the world. Wherever there's an expat, somebody has sent them a book for Christmas, and we get people ringing up. It's wonderful.
Good, good. I mean, it doesn't have a reputation for being kind of a nice place, Middlesbrough, does it? It seems to have like a bit of a, not that there's anything wrong with
industrial
history.
Industrial history. But it's like anywhere, home is where the heart is. And if you look to the inland instead of to the industrial part of Teesside, it's the most wonderful part of the country. It's very much like, West Durham and Northumberland. It's wonderful countryside, seaside, and it's got plenty of romance from Captain Cook going back into ancient days, So I would tend to disagree with you.
Right, okay, good. Now, you, as I said, you've had various business interests and worked on different engineering projects where you've had sort of a consultancy or management type role. And one of these projects that you got involved with was in Istanbul on the monorail project. Can you tell us a bit about that and how you got involved in the monorail in Turkey?
I was doing some work in Istanbul on various other projects, and I was invited if I would take a look at a number of projects that the government, semi-government bodies were looking at, and if there was anything there which I feel could be of interest to me. And the one that stood out immediately was the first monorail for Turkey, because Istanbul is a world city, it's an unbelievable city. It spans the two continents of Asia and Europe, and it's a population of nearly double London. It's 16 million. And it's a very vibrant city, and the infrastructure is the thing of the future that they need. They already have a fantastic metro system and overground railways, but to the east of Istanbul, where it's expanding the fastest, which is the Asian side, you have a bottleneck of the two bridges over the famous Bosphorus, which is the waterway that links the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, which is in the middle of Istanbul, through the Dardanelles to the Aegean. So this is the main heart of the waterway. And all traffic has to pass these bridges.
Yes.
So there's huge bottlenecks. It makes our traffic look tame.
Yeah.
And the next city that joins on to Istanbul is a city called Izmit, or Kocaeli. And it is a population of 3.5 million. And about 11 years ago, they suffered a horrendous earthquake on one side of the bay. And I was introduced to the person who was sort of managing the project for the government.
Yes.
And he explained to me, the benefit of such a project, and I found myself getting involved into it and spent nearly 2 years working on that project and bringing it nearly to fruition.
So was this Professor Berk Ustungdal?
That's correct.
This is the guy who was managing this project.
Yeah.
So a professor, a Turkish professor of Istanbul University.
Yeah.
Quite a young guy, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's a special part of the Turkish university system. It's called Istanbul Technical University.
Right.
And it has a huge, absolutely modern campus. High-tech, all brand new. It's remarkable. It's the equivalent of MIT in the States. It's a high-tech science campus. And Professor Burke, he's a multi-PhD in a number of disciplines. Although he sits in the electrical faculty, his speciality is tectonic plates and earthquake technology. He also is one of the key people in charge of the 5th largest radio telescope in the world, which is 360 degrees, fully rotational. And
so this guy, he's got all of these different, he's only in his late 30s and he's in charge of this telescope, he's in charge of the monorail, so he's like a key person that the Turkish government consult in any large project, would you say? So
I would say he is instrumental in or in charge of much of the space photography and imagery which comes to them, the spectrography of the planet, and all the minerals and things which are underground. And he sits on a lot of the major committees and ad hoc bodies which work with the Russians and Americans and various other bodies for their country to develop Turkey.
So you started to get to know this guy.
Yeah.
And you were sitting in a meeting with him at Istanbul University.
That's correct.
And you told me about some strange security procedures for getting into this.
It's very high-tech security. You will see on the photographs that I've given that it's a series of modern buildings, and there's a mound to the right. On that mound sits this fantastic telescope. And it's all linked underground.
Right.
Although the buildings are 3 stories high, and there's some very large buildings around it. His compound building, there's also 3 stories underneath.
Right.
And eventually, after about a year, I had clearance to go down just to the entrances, to the links to the other buildings. And when you go into the buildings, it's, you know, some of the tightest security I've seen. There would be guards within the perimeter fences around the building.
Yeah.
There would be security checks as we went in, and we had to go with passports. They would then give us special electronic card keys, which we had to wear all the time to go through. They would scan all electrical equipment without our knowing,
right?
E.g. telephones or computers, which were done in a covert way because there were machines. But when we then went to sit into his offices and so on, he was quite open, and he would say, right, I've got to scan everything again.
Right.
So there was a sense of security about the place.
So you were there on business as part of this monorail project.
That's
you were doing some kind of project management or some feasibility studies?
Well, I ended up running a consortium of people who wanted to run and operate and do a monorail project, and we were hoping to win the tender for that. So we had a head start.
Right. So you're in discussions with this guy.
Yeah.
And tell us about this particular meeting, Barry.
Right. After I'd got to know him, and we'd met outside of the university a couple of times, socially, a meal and so on, I was invited to go to the university, and I had a party of people with me, and we were in his main private boardroom. He has a whole floor to himself in this building. Right. And he has a lovely boardroom, very modern, white walls and so on. And we'd been discussing things. There was only one other person there who was my driver and operator, who introduced me to the project. And we were just having a general discussion, and out of the blue, he said, he flicked on his computer projector and threw up an image onto a wall, a circular window. And he said, do you know what this is? And sort of caught me unawares a little. I'm not really a scientist, but I'm fairly adept and have a lot of knowledge and articulate enough to gauge things. And I said, it looks like a very sophisticated circuitry for a chip, because I've worked with some companies like ARM and other chip companies around the world. And in our own area, we had 2 very good companies, Fujitsu and Siemens at one time, manufacturing chips. So I said, it looks a very complicated circuit. And he said, yeah, it is. It's 10,000 years old. Right. And I stopped in my tracks. And did you just say 10,000-year-old a chip? That's 10,000. I said, where is it? Where's it from? And he said, it's all around us. It's in the air. And I didn't quite understand what he was on about. And he basically was referring to the fact that there's all sorts of frequencies around us. Right. And I don't know if they're correct, whether it's ether or atmosphere or whatever. And he said, we've got it from there. And I said, but how do you know it's 10,000 years old? And he implied, without saying, that it was from a craft. Right. And the discussion obviously stopped in my mind. So
why do you think he showed you it then?
I
mean, well, let's just say that this had come out of a recovered alien or ancient craft. Why would he show it to you?
I think the next question is pertinent to what he said to me. He said, do you know what Vimanas are? That's V-I-M-A-N-A-S, Vimanas. And he was quite surprised that I said I do. Yeah. Because if you were saying it to most people, they'd probably think it's some form of Vimto drink. But
it's part of the Hindu religious texts. Is that
the ancient Hindu religious texts, such as we would have the Quran, the Jews have the Bible and the Torah, and the Hindus have a series of religious books and texts which are called the Rig Veda. They have 2 other books which are called the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which is more recent times. The Sanskrit of the original goes back many thousands of years. And in there is a whole section dealing with Vimanas, which were flying machines. Even to the point where within the holy text, they describe how you can build such a machine, and of death rays and so on. And if one was to read it, you would say, well, how is this, you know?
Do they describe kind of a nuclear war as well?
Yes.
In those texts?
Definitely. It describes the nuclear weapons and ray guns,
so what would
lasers.
Sort of scholars and academics, how do they pass this off?
Well, it's written into, like most ancient texts, if one was to read the Bible, you will come across a description of a flying ship that the prophet Ezekiel.
Welcome back on board the Starship. Now at RichPlanet.net we are engaged in a number of research activities. We are dedicated to uncovering the truth about a range of issues that our government, or should I say those that manipulate our government, seem reluctant to talk about or reluctant to sponsor any research into. In order to carry out scientific investigation of physical evidence that we have in our possession, I would like to appeal to any viewers that could help us by providing scientific testing skills. The kind of people that we're looking for include material scientists, chemists, microbiologists, geneticists, pathologists, and forensic scientists. And the kind of equipment that we would like access to includes mass spectroscopy equipment, other technology for identifying and examining the microbiology of unknown substances, the use of a scanning electron microscope, use of genetic testing equipment for examining genetic material from humans, animals, and unknown sources. Now, unfortunately, we've got no cash, so this would all be purely on a voluntary basis. So if you think that you have any of these skills or access to such equipment and would like to help us, then please get in touch in complete confidence by emailing me at richard@richplanet.net. I'm talking with Bari Chohan, who worked alongside a very intriguing character called Professor Berk Ustungdar. Now, Professor Ustungdar works for Istanbul University. He's got various PhDs and is a key figure in Turkish government, I guess. So you were just telling us before the break that he puts this thing up on the screen and it looks like a diagram of some kind of electronic circuit, and then he tells you it's 10,000 years old, and you're there with your mouth hanging open.
Absolutely.
So he then asks you whether you know about the Vimanas, and you said, well, actually I do. So take it from there. He was kind of...
the fact that he'd linked the two things together,
So shortly after he'd shown you this picture, he then asked you about the
Vimanas. And then he intimated to me, as I asked, I said, well, why is this circuitry and this chip, is it from a craft? Are you trying to back engineer something? And he smiled, a wry smile, and my next question was, well, what is it? Is it a Russian craft or is it an American one, extraterrestrial? And he smiled and he said, it's ours. We have our own.
Did he mean by that we have recovered an ancient artifact, do you think?
No,
or built it?
It seemed to be intimating that they had various recovered spacecraft.
Right.
And plural.
Like from modern times, or dug one up, you mean?
I can't be precise on that, whether it's something which they've discovered, or whether it's something which they've taken in modern times.
So you think they've got... and he said that he didn't understand how it worked.
No, I asked, was the chip to do with the craft and whether trying to back engineer things, and he didn't give me a direct answer. But was very defensive when I said, oh, it must be American or Russian. And he said, no, they're ours. And he meant it in a plural way.
And when he said they're ours, do you think he just meant property of Turkey then, or no other country?
Yeah, property of Turkey.
Right, because you know Turkey has had its fair share of UFO sightings.
Well, it coincides with two things in Turkey. Recently, there's been some spate of phenomenal actual daylight and nighttime sightings.
Right.
There's a very famous Turkish ufologist, Cayton, who has a wonderful museum on ufology in Turkey, and attends most of the symposiums and conferences around the world. He had a recent one, I think it would be beginning of this year, end of last year.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic footage of a clear UFO in Turkey.
Right.
There's some footages of over cities, major cities, and they certainly had over most of the bases. It's a huge American base in the eastern side of Turkey, in Shilin and in Shilak. I can't pronounce it properly because they're C's or J's.
Right.
But there's a whole record of sightings going back into ancient times, because every ancient empire that we know of, going way past the Sumerians and before that the Hittites, the Babylonians and so on, who were in Turkey, in central Turkey, and some of the oldest cities that we know of in modern archaeology are all situated in the Turkish hinterland of Anatolia.
Right.
And through to Istanbul and through the whole swathe from Mesopotamia and Egypt coming up.
Didn't they dig up that 47-inch human femur in Turkey? That was an archaeological find where it's meant to be a human leg bone, which was like
there's a number of very, very interesting pre-ancient archaeology, which I think modern archaeology and modern science seems to limit us to civilization of the last few thousand years. Yeah. You know, up to 4,000 or 5,000 BC. However, if one looks at the actual records, you'll find that the archaeology dates way past into the past. And I think that particular instance, although I have not read up on it too much, is one of many which have found extra large human beings existed, or what we would call the David and Goliath, were real.
The Nephilim.
All right. Nephilim.
Now, you mentioned America and Russia, and Turkey kind of, you think this guy, this Professor Berk Ustandar, is leaning more towards the Russian side in terms of his confidences, perhaps?
I don't mean it in a political sense, because I think politically probably the US has a much clearer influence on Turkish politics. But I think you'll find that all the governments work together. And what my inference was, that they were very closely and aware of the sightings in the Black Sea, around the Black Sea area, the surrounding countries from Ukraine through Russia to Georgia, Armenia, the mountains there. And there are special minerals that are connected to power sources and ancient workings of precious metals like gold and so on. And he seemed to indicate that this is all to do with the same sort of areas of discussion.
So when you asked him, you said, where did this thing come from? And he said, like, it's all around, or it's from you know, I mean...
What he said was that the actual chip, he said, has been plucked out of the air. And what they meant by that, which in subsequent conversations and over that nearly 2-year period I worked with him, is that everything has a frequency and a colour which coordinates to a frequency, and that it's time relative. Right. So that if you have the accessibility to frequencies and understand how they work, then you can pluck out the information which is in the air still. And that's how we differentiate planets which are billions of miles away in terms of light years, because they're the past, and you're getting that frequency of their colour.
So do you think, I'd quite like to see this circuit diagram. I mean, what do you think he would say if you asked him to email it to you?
Well, right up to the shooting of this programme, as you know, I was not declaring the name.
Right.
And it's only because he finally answered an email which gave me a tacit go-ahead without saying so, but didn't say I can't speak about things. One can always ask, I guess.
So There's not going to be any repercussions for mentioning his name on this show, is there?
Well, I
Barry?
hope not. If I'm not here next year, you better start looking for me.
All right. Well, it'll be very interesting to see this diagram. You know.
I certainly are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now there are other strange sort of factors here about this professor. He's quite a short guy.
Yeah.
5'3".
We actually give him the nickname E.T.
You nickname him E.T.
Yeah.
He has interests or expertise in computing, electrical engineering, earthquakes, spectral and satellite imaging, mining.
Yeah. Ancient mining as well.
Ancient archaeology.
Yeah.
And so he spoke of a mystic called Rumi.
No, it's a coincidence.
Right.
One of the accountant colleagues of mine who was working on the project I brought over from England was interested in a mystic called Rumi.
Yeah.
Who is I'm not quite sure the time period, but he's a very famous poet and mystic,
Right.
a Sufi mystic.
Going back how many years?
Several hundred years, I believe.
All right.
And he wanted to go and visit his birthplace and shrine, and he said, "Oh, it's in a town in Turkey called Konya." And
This is the professor we're talking about. Yeah.
no, this is my friend.
Oh, your friend.
And I said to him, "Oh, we'll have to ask Professor Burke, because I believe he's from Konya and his parents live there." Mm-hmm. So a few days later, when we were having a meeting at the university with the professor, my friend Riaz says to him, "Oh, I understand you're from Konya." He said, "We want to go there to visit the shrine of Rumi and so on." And the professor just looked at him, sort of gave him a glance and wondered where the conversation was going. And he said, "I am a direct bloodline of," I think he said 28 generations.
Right.
So it gives you an idea, or so many generations, of Rumi.
Of Rumi.
And I thought it was absolutely fascinating
Right.
that such a coincidence, together with the other coincidences we had, that he's very powerful, very intellectually, mentally astute, but he's also physically powerful for a small man.
Right.
And the reason we called him E.T. was that he seemed to have like a permanent stubble, but no hair growth.
You mentioned how he could go without sleep for several days.
Unbelievably, as I said, he's strong, fit. He's a world standard surf sailboard champion, and does that for his spare time and his release. And he can go days. I mean, we find it difficult, for a day or so to keep awake. But he would go days, 3 days, 4 days, no problem. He'd be flying to one end of Turkey, coming back, working in the university, and then still having all the meetings with us. And he would rarely sleep, very rarely sleep.
I mean, if you listen to people like David Icke, they claim that certain bloodlines are protected over millennia to try and keep the pure blood from ancient times. Maybe that's
certainly, there's got to be some merit in that sort of argument. People like this professor and very many other elite people in the world, I think there must be some truth in it, because when you look at him, he's human. He's the same as us,
right.
But there's definitely something different. He has a sanguinary light yellow complexion, at times, but his intellectual ability is unbelievable.
So just
speaks pure English,
right.
but better than most people here.
Does he speak many other languages, or?
Yeah, I believe he's Japanese,
right.
Russian.
Okay. Now, we mentioned UFO sightings in Turkey. Would you care to expand on that, Barry? Well,
Turkey has been one of the hotspots in recent years. But as I was also saying, if you go throughout history, you'll find right away through ancient times, to pre-Noah, so to say, there have been sightings and written accounts of UFOs, the most famous being obviously the Sumerian empire, which is just south of Turkey, but spread into that whole eastern side of Turkey, where Professor Burke is involved in ancient mining and redoing the spoils from ancient gold mines and special metals.
Right.
And basically there's more there which has been left in the spoil than there is you know, underneath. There's no need to go underneath. And you will find that the whole of the Sumerian texts and the Hittites who followed on, and the other Anatolian civilizations and south into Babylon, they all have a well-known, documented, written history of extraterrestrials visiting Earth. They all have full knowledge of the 10 planets, you know, which we didn't know of until the 1900s. They have a written dialogue and history of Earth visitation and the gods, very similar. You change the names a little, the language a little, and it's the same set of gods for ancient Egypt, India, China. You'll find there's a symmetry and a synergy of all these ancient religious beliefs, and they must come from a pre-direct source. You know, one can look at language, Richard. I'll give you an example. Sanskrit is the oldest language known of written Hindu verses, and it's about 5000 BC or pre that. In modern Indian, and from that time, you have the word for fire is Agni, A-G-N-I.
Yeah.
And if you go to ancient Latin, or the derivative Latin, what is the word for fire? Ignite.
Right.
Igni. Igni and Agni, the A becomes an I. Therefore, they derive from a mother language above that. And that will go back again. And I think you will find that it's the same with all these written texts or unwritten languages. There will have been verbal languages before. And they go back to direct sources. So they may change a letter. They may change a pronunciation. They may change to something of the topography of the land. But the essence is always from the same root.
I mean, I'm not really educated on archaeology or ancient cultures or anything, but, you know, there's the belief that there was a massive world flood, kind of 10,000 BC or whatever, that, you know, and there were civilizations before then, advanced civilizations. Okay, and now you mentioned this telescope. It's the 5th largest telescope in the world. In
the 5th largest, fully rotational, 360 degree.
Right.
Maybe not in volume and size, but the size that can turn a full 360 degrees. And it's set on a mound in the middle of Istanbul Technical University with a whole lot of underground connections. And it actually takes all the satellite photography and imagery and spectrographic results, which shows all the minerals on the Earth. They're all in different colours of water and so on. So you can pinpoint where oil is, where gold is, and certain minerals.
Yes, yes.
And it's used for, obviously, space research and
so, I mean,
tracking.
You know, on this show we've covered, you know, the UFO cover-up and the fact that it's all kept secret by not necessarily governments, but the people who control things. I mean, is it the same in Turkey, do you think? I mean, does this guy have access to the information, and he perhaps is part of covering that up? Why doesn't he, you know, put what he knows on Turkish television? And tell
I think
the people
you'll find that on Turkish media, it's certainly much more pronounced and mainstream, the knowledge, acknowledgement of sightings, which are regular, and written pros and cons on.
So it's not poo-pooed as much as it is?
No, definitely not. And recently, again, I think you're aware of before the Chinese Prime Minister went to America the other week, there was a whole series of pronouncements on Chinese national television that they believe that Obama was going to make an announcement that there is contact. Whether that's a false flag or whether it's a cover-up, there is definitely proven lights and UFOs in recent times. So there's a race on between the Chinese and the Americans, possibly.
All right then, Barry. Well, we'll talk about this again after the break, UFO disclosure, because it's something that I'm very interested in. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go away. Welcome back on board the Starship. I'm talking with Bari Chohan, who has had a very colourful life so far, and worked in various businesses and various ventures, and has visited lots of different countries. Now, we were talking about China and America in UFO disclosure? Because there was this rumor that I read about on the internet that I think a Chinese news channel had reported that Barack Obama was going to reveal something or hint towards something about UFOs. Now, I started researching this, and then I found that some rag of an American newspaper had said, oh, Obama's going to say something, and then the Chinese TV station picked up on that news article and then perhaps exaggerated it. So I don't know, it's...
like you,
there's always these rumours about disclosure.
Like yourself, I came across it quite recently, and I looked beyond the first story, which was that there's going to be disclosure. And one had to look at the fact that there's a possible race on between the Chinese and the Americans to give an indication or a disclosure, not so much of UFOs, that there are extraterrestrial beings and that the governments are in contact with them. Now, it could well be blown out of proportion, but if you take the gist of the story, the premise, and work it against what's happened in China recently, is that there's a known fact that several airports have been closed down. It's on record, it's proven, and due to lights and buzzing of unfamiliar craft. And I think that that gives you another perspective on the story. Right. They say that there is some truth in the story. And what you'll find with the American media, which is wholly controlled and a total mouthpiece for 6 or 7 corporations, yes, who have vested interests. I mean,
so that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. 6 corporations own 95% of the media. That includes all the sub-radio channels and TV channels. They're all syndicated. For example, people don't realise that NBC, which is one of the equivalent of our BBC, is actually owned by General Electric. Yeah. General Electric is never going to let them advertise about them having poisoned the earth with certain toxins that they create, and they are the biggest arms manufacturer in the world. Yeah. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox. Yeah. And they have their view on things. Yes. Disney Channel own ABC. Yeah. And so what happens is huge American corporations have a vested interest in not letting us have full disclosure. Yes. And the same with the BBC here. And now, because of the internet and because of accessibility to worldwide television channels, yes, of unknown academics, there was a wonderful lady in Finland and Norway that you've had programs on.
Rowney Kilda.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. I would never have heard of her or her background and what she's disclosed. So it gives people the opportunity to work with the internet, look at sources. Yeah. I brought you full information on the manufacturing and English text of a Vimana, as per in the Hindu holy books. That is because we have a wide reach of knowledge now. And I don't have to go look into the British Museum to go and get a book.
A good example of that is what's happening in Egypt now. Yep. You know, this revolution.
You get the other side of it.
Exactly. You know, I've been watching that on Press TV, the Iranian news channel.
Yeah, if you look at the press on Al Jazeera, on RT, on any other channel which is an alternative view to what we get, you suddenly say, well,
they're not the same.
We're not. They're 2 different stories. Yeah. So then you will see what they don't disclose and what we disclose, and the same happens in all the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq or anywhere else. There are 2 sides, and it is truly filtered. So can you imagine how much they filter about UFOs?
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm just going to. We've talked endlessly about UFOs on this show, but I'm going to change the subject to another one of the subjects that we've covered on this show, and that is false flag terrorism. And because you watched my interview with Muad'Dib,
I did, yes.
And just to recap on that, Muad'Dib produced a film called 7/7 Ripple Effect, which makes the case that the London bombings were in fact orchestrated by intelligence agencies, and there's quite a lot of evidence for that. And he's currently in Wandsworth prison, unfortunately, waiting to stand trial for trying to pervert the course of justice. So, you know, what are your thoughts on Muad'Dib in the broader context of international, you know, Al-Qaeda and terrorism? Barry, what are your thoughts? Because you're a Muslim.
I am, yeah. I would be classed more like a secular Muslim.
Right.
Births, deaths and marriages, to the mosque, like most modern day Christians, I guess. But I do have a stronger view relating to my culture and religion since the incidents of the last 10 years and how things have been very focused on using the terrorists as a tool for the breakdown and the containment of people's freedoms.
Yes.
And I think that is what we have to look at, because the likelihood of a terrorist action being on any person, which was stated just this week by American government figures and in the UK, are millions to one.
Yeah.
Less than having an accident on a train or something.
Yeah.
So we have succumbed to government pressure and given away our rights, and this has been proven by the case of Muhammad, whereby a man who is a citizen of Ireland has actually not perverted the course of justice. He sent some information to the court for them to have a look at before any decision is made.
The case that you referred to there that Muhammad sent his DVDs to, that was a few years ago now, and that was a separate case where they were trying to convict 3 friends of the alleged bombers for helping them.
That's right.
And they were all acquitted. They were all innocent.
But the bombers haven't... all news is always stating that as if these people have been convicted.
Yes.
Obviously, they're not here, they're dead.
Yeah.
But whether they died in the bombings or if people are still aware that 3 people were shot in Canary Wharf.
Yes.
And the whole gist of Muhammad 7/7 ripple effect is that these people were patsies.
Yeah.
To Peter Powell, and the odds of such a exercise being conducted on exactly the day when they're there on the same targets is, I think, even Las Vegas wouldn't give you odds.
Yeah. So, I mean, have you found any change in people's attitude towards you as a Muslim in the UK since all this, well, I'll say this false terrorism has been concocted by,
I think I feel more that one has to be careful of what you say.
Yeah.
Because media, and especially certain newspapers, give a very wrong impression and a right-wing impression of everything. So one tends to then start thinking, you've got to be careful who you're seen with. You've got to be careful what you say.
Yeah.
And that is instilling fear, and it is curtailing people's right of expression. I feel that more than myself as a Muslim, as I'm not bearded, I'm not wearing things. I think people who wear traditional things and are a bit more fundamental in their religious beliefs. I do it all in English, so I wouldn't I wouldn't say that I feel it myself,
Right.
but I certainly think generally that there is a bad press, and whereas 10 years ago people were very happy and there was a mixing of everything, there's a little bit of an isolationism where there are larger communities who are maybe not so expressive or articulate and who are a bit more religious and viewed openly.
Yes.
Certainly I think most people in that category would find it's gone a backward step.
Okay, Barry. Now, we were talking before this interview, and you were telling us about where some of your interests originated from, and you mentioned the Sunday Times of all places.
Yeah.
So tell us about why the Sunday Times influenced you.
I think I better pre-qualify it. It's the Sunday Times before Rupert Murdoch
Right, all right.
owned it. When the Sunday Times first brought out the wonderful Sunday Times colour supplements, sometimes in the 70s, it had some really cutting-edge stories, journalism, that it put over to the public where we were unaware of things. And my interest in the paranormal, in conspiracy theories, and most of the things we've discussed really stem from a number of incidences that I read upon and came across for the first time in my early 20s. And the 4 covers which always are embedded in my mind was one after the Vietnam War, the picture of the young girl running through a napalm
Yes.
cloud at My Lai.
Yes.
The second one, I guess, was one would always put the space race and program of reaching the moon. But the one that really sticks out in my mind was aerial photography, hence my link with the professor,
Yeah.
and the question of frequencies and colours. First of all, there was this wonderful shot of the planet Earth in the black void of space.
Yes.
And when you went into the story, it showed you reducing onto the hemispheres, America itself, central part of the USA, around the lakes, Illinois, Chicago, into a park in Chicago, into a part of the park. And then the last picture was a couple
Yeah.
laid on the grass reading a book.
Yeah.
And the front page of the Sunday Times was that book.
Right.
And that was 40 years ago.
And in the book was a picture of the Earth in space.
No,
which
no,
is what the original,
no. You could read the text.
Oh, you could read the text.
And what it was showing you when you then went inside, it was a series of photographs coming down to that book
Right. Right.
from Earth,
So it's telling you that you can read.
magnify.
You can read the text on a book from space using technology.
And this is 40 years ago.
Right.
So what do we have around us? And I guess before that, what really ignited my mind on everything and about the soul and about the essence of humanity is there was a Russian photographer called Karelian.
Mm-hmm.
And Karelian photography was, I believe, in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And he developed a way of capturing the aura of anything living.
Right.
Or organic, I believe. And there was a series of photographs which actually capture the aura of a human being, a living being,
Yeah.
or a plant. And if it was cut, there would be a strand, an astral strand. So from that, it gave me an alternative viewpoint and an alternative thought pattern from what we are actually imbued with and taught from our childhood.
Right.
And I guess that
Did they
became
have photographs of these
Yeah.
people with auras in the Sunday Times
absolutely.
supplement?
Yeah, anybody can look it up on the net.
Mm-hmm.
You'll find Karelian photography. It's taken for granted. What do you think CAT scans are? What do you think all the things that we have now? The things that, the medical scanners in Star Trek. These are real things now.
Yeah.
Because what they do, they check your colour, auras, and your frequencies. And that goes back to what Dr. Professor Burke was saying, that everything has a frequency. So when we're looking at planets in telescopes, you're looking at a light which is no longer there, but it's travelled through time. And the astronomers can tell you that's a gas planet, or this has got that
Yeah.
on it, and it tells you by colour. So colours and frequencies are what is the individual signature of everything.
Right. I see.
Hence, music
I
is
tend
very
to-
is very important to all of
I
us.
mean, I tend to think of frequencies more in a very sort of physics type way, i.e. How many megahertz or gigahertz it is in terms of cycles per second, and what frequency of light that is. So I don't really fully understand the whole thing about auras. I don't understand how it works. I would even say that maybe the people who photograph them don't understand what they are completely. I mean, I'm on the fence.
Skeptical.
I'm on the fence.
Skeptical. Well, we often hear, and I can actually relate to that because I had an out-of-body experience.
Right. Okay.
When I
You
was
brought that in a bit late in the interview,
yeah,
Barry.
I did. I had a car crash with my first
Right.
vehicle when I was 18, 19.
Yeah.
And I went through the windscreen.
Right.
And I had a full-length leather coat on. It was New Year's Eve,
Right.
68. I was a young man. I had a brand new car, and we were on the road was packed with ice and a dual carriageway, and I had to try and get ahead of some traffic. Hit this wall of snow all piled up, and remember sailing in the air. And I remember looking at my body hitting the road first. I had a full-length leather coat on, which was scratched off, and I remember my body looking at it and looking at lights and then hitting the physical body. So I actually do believe in an aura.
So how long, you know, did that experience last? Was it just a brief thing?
In fact, it was not only that. It would, if I was to say what I thought, or what I thought I saw my whole life like a videotape, and there was no videotapes in them days.
Yeah.
As if everything's in a nanosecond probably. But it was the time it took. It was obviously my body must have gone quite high.
Yeah, I have heard a few people.
And so I have been. I'm not skeptical. I'm open-minded about this. And so when I saw things like the Carillion photography, and to take your point up on frequencies, I'm not a scientist. Right. Most of my knowledge is accrued and what I've learned over my lifetime. I'm a young 60. And if you look at frequencies in a different direction, look at any future weapons programs on your Sky channels. You can have high decibel frequency weapons, and the weapons of the future are not bullets. They are not what we understand to be weapons. They are sound weapons. They are laser weapons. They are weapons that will blind you. Right. But the sound weapon is unbelievable, that you can have, you know, hundreds of thousands of decibels, and yet you can walk in front of it. That is all to do with frequency.
Oh yeah, I mean, what destroyed?
It can destroy a tank.
What destroyed the Twin Towers, for example?
Well, there's a lot of debate. But
there's a lot of debate
certainly
about that.
It was more than just nanothermite.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't pulverize steel and that building.
All right, and Barry, thanks very much indeed for all these insights. We've covered a wide range of areas, and you know, there's a few things I want to go and check up on, and do see if you can get that diagram off the...
I will try my best on my next visit to Professor Berk Ostang.
Okay, right. Well,
it's been a pleasure being your guest.
All right, thanks, Barry.
Thank you very much.
It just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, keep your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show. Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Tickets are available now from the Oaken Gates Theatre website. Further future venues include Weston-super-Mare, Leeds, Barnsley and Newcastle upon Tyne, with further venues to be arranged. Find more details on the RichPlanet.net website.
Yeah. She passed away last June, and 77 years old, and she came to England in 48. Right. And in those days, one travelled from India by ship. And straight after partition, she was married and came here. My father had been in Britain since the mid-30s. Yeah.
And you you did a degree in politics and history, is that right?
My first degree was in politics and history at Bradford University.
All right.
And then I was in the politics department at Durham University, where I was doing an MA by thesis on the political growth of Middlesbrough, 1850 to 53.
Okay, and throughout the years you've had, you know, a wide variety of business interests in property, and, you know, you were on the board for One North East, which is the North East funding agency. There's a picture of you there. Yeah. So you've also had, you've worked on, or you've had a screenplay produced on BBC dramas that you've written.
I was very proud of that. It's a little autobiographical. Right. And it was set in Middlesbrough.
What was that called?
It was called Bottles. And
Bottles.
We were very fortunate that at that time the BBC actually had two plays based in Middlesbrough a few weeks apart. One was the wonderful Alan Bleasdale's Boys from the Black Stuff, and mine was on a few weeks later. But I was very fortunate that mine was on after the most popular program at the time on TV,
Right.
Starsky and
Starsky
Hutch,
and Hutch,
the cops show from America. And we were on straight after, so we had a fantastic viewing.
All right.
But it was all set in Middlesbrough. It was
Right.
quite
How you got involved in the monorail in
yeah,
Turkey?
I was doing some work in Istanbul on various other projects, and I was invited if I would take a look at a number of projects that the government, semi-government bodies were looking at, and if there was anything there which I feel could be of interest to me. And the one that stood out immediately was the first monorail for Turkey, because Istanbul is a world city, is an unbelievable city. It spans the two continents of Asia and Europe, and it's a population of nearly double London. It's 16 million. And it's a very vibrant city, and the infrastructure is the thing of the future that they need. They already have a fantastic metro system and overground railways, but to the east of Istanbul, where it's expanding the fastest, which is the Asian side, you have a bottleneck of the two bridges over the famous Bosphorus, which is the waterway that links the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, which is in the middle of Istanbul, through the Dardanelles to the Aegean. So this is the main heart of the waterway. And all traffic has to pass these bridges.
Yes.
So there's huge bottlenecks, makes our traffic look tame.
Yeah.
And the next city that joins on to Istanbul is a city called Izmit, or Kocaeli. And it is a population of 3.5 million. And about 11 years ago, they suffered a horrendous earthquake on one side of the bay. And I was introduced to the person who was sort of
Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's guest is a businessman and playwright who has interests in ancient archaeology, UFOs, and has had fascinating experiences whilst working on engineering projects in Turkey. Here to talk about his life and experiences, I'd like to welcome on board the starship Bari Chohan.
I'm glad to be here, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Okay, and you've brought in a few things for me to look over, which kind of document some of your life, and because your family originated from India.
That's correct.
A
yes.
Muslim family.
Yeah.
And they were ophthalmic.
Homeopathic ophthalmic physicians.
Okay.
And they've been in the UK since late Victorian period, 1880s.
So you were born here, weren't you? You were born in Nottingham.
Yes.
But you've lived in Middlesbrough all your life.
All my life, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's, most sort of British Muslims, their families came here kind of in the 70s and 80s, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Well,
your family goes back in Britain to...
over 100 years.
Over 100 years.
Yeah.
And you've given me a picture of your mother here. Put that on the screen. And sadly, she's died very recently.
Interesting.
And your brother has researched photography of Middlesbrough and published this book. RAF Chohan is your brother.
Yeah,
and this
I
book
contributed. I contributed to it.
Lots of historic pictures of Middlesbrough.
And the actual anecdotes, the written part. In fact, most pictorial history books rarely sell more than a few hundred copies per annum, doesn't matter where they are. That's now in the 7th edition, and I think for a town the size of Middlesbrough, it's quite remarkable. There's about 15,000 copies so far been sold. And we still get calls in the middle of the night from Australia and Canada. It's amazing the book has travelled all over the world. Wherever there's an expat, Somebody has sent them a book for Christmas, and we
Right.
get people ringing up. It's wonderful.
Good, good. I mean, it doesn't have a reputation for being kind of a nice place, Middlesbrough, does it? It seems to have like a bit of a, you know, not that there's anything wrong with
industrial
Cleveland
history,
and Middlesbrough, but
industrial history. But it's like anywhere. Home is where the heart is, and if you look to the inland instead of to the industrial part of Teesside,
Yeah.
it's the most wonderful part of the country. It's very much like, you know, West Durham and Northumberland. It's wonderful countryside, seaside, and it's got plenty of romance from
Right.
Captain Cook going back into ancient days. You know,
Yeah.
so I would tend to disagree with
right,
you.
okay, good. Now, you, as I said, you've had various business interests and worked on different engineering projects where you've had sort of a consultancy or management type role. And one of these projects that you got involved with was in Istanbul on the monorail project.
That's
Can you
correct.
tell us a bit about that and
Managing the project for the government.
yes,
And he explained to me, you know, the benefit of such a project, and I found myself getting involved into it and spent nearly 2 years working on that project and bringing it nearly to fruition.
so was this Professor Berk Ustungdal?
That's correct.
This
yes.
is the guy who was managing this project.
Yeah.
So a professor, a Turkish professor of Istanbul University,
Yeah.
quite a young guy actually.
Yeah, well, it's a special part of the Turkish university system. It's called Istanbul Technical University.
Right.
And it has a huge, absolutely modern campus. High-tech, all brand new. It's remarkable. It's the equivalent of MIT in the States. It's a high-tech science campus. And Professor Burke, he's a multi-PhD in a number of disciplines. Although he sits in the electrical faculty, his speciality is tectonic plates and earthquake technology. He also is one of the key people in charge of the 5th largest radio telescope in the world, which is 360 degrees, fully rotational. And
So this guy, he's got all of these different, he's only in his late 30s and he's in charge
Yeah.
of this telescope, he's in charge of the monorail, so he's like a key person that the Turkish government consult in any large project, would you say? So
I would say he is instrumental in or in charge of much of the space photography and imagery which comes to them, the spectrography of the planet
Yeah.
and all the minerals,